So, Warhorse. Well, it's been out in the cinema for a fair while now, and by the time you hear this, it'll probably be out on DVD. A Spielberg film sounds like a sensible place to start a film blog. So here we are. In brief, very brief summary, a young Devon lad from a poor and rather dysfunctional family gets a fancy but totally inappropriate horse, which after a fair old while of ponderous class struggle, gets drafted into the First World War and passed around like it was a 1970s key party. Now, as I'm so late to the review party, a lot has obviously been said about this film. How it features a cast of largely unknowns to complement the completely unknown equine Joey. It also features some fantastic actors and some of the more minor roles. Some people have had a problem with just how chocolate box perfect Devon looks, and there's no doubting it's a wonderful place, but if heaven exists, there's no way that it'll be as beautiful as Devon is in this film. I don't actually have a problem with this, though. The film looks beautiful, and it's a fine equipoise to the horror of a war we all know is around the corner. The film looks epic, and every inch a Spielberg film, even when we have three peasants arguing in a hovel. Particular attention has been paid to the colour and the tone of the film, and shot for shot the whole thing looks stunning. Think of the video to safety dance with Steven Spielberg at the helm. And one less midget. Something else that some other people, far more punctual than I, have picked up on is the episodic nature of the piece. And this, I have to say, is a bit of an issue for me. Once Joey's been conscripted by the terribly nice chap from the local cavalry, we are, while avoiding spoilers, presented with several other groups of characters through the passive nature of the horse. So think Ryan Gosling as the eponymous driver, but less psychopathic, and a horse. Okay, that doesn't work, never mind. It's in the cracks between these interlocking stories that the film suffers some pacing issues, and the final film suffers as a result. While the different sides of the conflict are all represented, there's simply one story too many, and it's very obvious to me which one could have been left on the editing floor. And no one would have noticed. Despite some fine acting in the French peasant section, and seeing a few interesting bits and pieces here and there of being caught up in the middle of the conflict, the film ultimately suffers as a result of its inclusion. There are also a couple of storylines that never seem to go anywhere. I'm particularly thinking of a romantic rivalry at the beginning, which simply gets set to one side. One thing you can't fail to address in this film is its sentimentality, and this has been given as both a compliment and as a criticism. If we think back to Saving Private Ryan, there was a small scene in that film in which Mrs. Ryan is waiting to receive some rather bad news. And as the military vehicle speeds along to her farm, we can see her sewing a gingham skirt, or it's more likely a woolen scarf on one of her sons. And I felt this was in the midst of all the grey and the bleak, fairly awful depiction of war, something that just didn't fit, as I felt the ending to that film didn't fit. However, Warhorse from the get-go is sentimental. There's a rather early scene where man and horse are ploughing a particularly tough field, and I totally got it swept away with what was happening. It's the most exciting farming scene I can think of, and it's something that Spielberg does remarkably well. It's taken for granted that it's easy to tug at the heartstrings, but if it was easy, I think everyone would do it. If I think back to just today, I've seen a couple of famine relief adverts, stray dog shelters, and this sort of thing on television. Bear in mind, of course, that this is reality, and I can sit there, munching on my deep fried snack or whatever it was, and I don't bat an eyelid. But when you see a work of fiction that Spielberg has directed, you can get carried away with it. And to look at it another way, it's a very fine line between tugging at the heartstrings, getting you excited, and laughing at it. I mean, if you think about Armageddon, the ending to that film is so schmaltzy. And another one is the Titanic, where we're supposed to relate to these characters amongst everything, and it's more difficult than we might believe. Warhorse also features epic and sweeping battle scenes, which are rather well directed, and they are exciting. But while there is death and violence, it's not as it was in Saving Private Ryan, with men wandering around the beach looking for their limbs. It's a more traditional Hollywood way of depicting the violence. It's more cowboys and Indians. It doesn't feel like a cop-out to get a low age rating, because you get swept up in the action, because you care about the characters. They've been fairly well developed, and you hope they get through it. So it's really more Gone with the Wind than it is Michael Bay, and I can certainly say that this is a good thing. It's classical, traditional filmmaking. So, having mentioned the emotional bond you feel with the characters, not all the characters are going to get through to the end of the film. And some of the scenes, and one in particular featuring a windmill, are sad and actually quite shocking. If you've got kids, I suspect you'll know if they're mature enough to cope with the subject matter. But I'd suggest 12 is a sensible minimum age to see this film. I think there are about 3 times throughout the film that I had to omit a manly cough to cover an exceptionally manly sob, and this is no bad thing. Needless to say, the war is not what any of the characters are expecting, and the experience of war leaves its physical and emotional scars on all those involved. I've read some headlines on buses and the like that suggest that this is Spielberg's best film, and to me this is simply not true. It's not E.T., it's not Jaws, but what we do have is a very well crafted and skillfully made film that suffers from being a little too long, and by its nature it lacks a direct narrative. Some people will love it, fewer still will hate it, but most of us will have a very good time.